Hello and welcome to Fantasy View, with me, Jason Hubbard. Here I review fantasy novels to let you know what to read if it catches your fancy, and I let you know about the books I wrote at the end of each episode. Last time I checked out Luthiel's song Dreams of the Ringed Veil by Robert Marston Fennet. Now here's the sequel, Luthiel's song The War of Mists. Quick recap. 15-year-old Luthiel has agreed to take the place of her foster sister as the latest sacrifice to the dreaded Viril, who will wage war once again if sacrifices aren't given. As I said before, I started reading the sequel before I read the first installment, which may have been a mistake. I mean, when I learned that there were characters like a werewolf, a swordsman, a sorcerer, and a dragon the size of a house cat, I just took it in stride and treated it like a typical episode of Adventure Time. But then the plot came into play, which involves Luthiel having a dream in which she looked through the eyes of an owl, her magic sword reconstructing itself a little, and a journey she had to take to the elven people to convince them that the Viril are really no more than puppy dogs who just need love. Oh, and they need food. And where will this food come from? Why, from Luthiel herself, of course. It sounds insane, which is why I read the first book after going about a quarter into the second one. Afterwards, I finally understood some things. If the author's intent was to confuse me enough to make me read the first installment, then mission accomplished. I'm not sure if I should be pissed off or gazing in admiration. I guess in some ways I'm still confused. So, where to begin with this one? Well, first off, I'm going to say something that may sound cold and judgmental, but I can't help calling someone for what she is. Luthiel is a bleeding heart. Remember what I said about her having a dream in which she looked through the eyes of an owl? Well, the dream ended with the owl getting munched on by a ferocious beast. Afterward, Luthiel expresses to her friends how really bad she feels about that owl, because the owl actually had feelings and thoughts as humans do. Because that's just the kind of world this is. A Disney cartoon, in other words. And pretty much throughout the entire book, Luthiel expresses how concerned she is for the feelings and well-being of others. A far cry, I gotta say, from the subject of the first episode I did of Fantasy View. Luthiel just feels like your typical female fantasy character who does healing magic. Thus, she limits the consequences of battle scenes and such. The only difference is that Luthiel is the main focus of the story, not just a supporting character. Does this mean I should accuse the author of being unimaginative? Well, the author says in the foreword that Luthiel is based on his own mother, who was a very spiritual woman and unfairly criticized by certain people for being so. So if the author wished to immortalize a very influential lady in his life, I couldn't possibly be the son of a bitch who tells him off for doing so. I'll leave that to other, less scrupulous reviewers. Near the beginning of the story, someone cries out, "Road trip!" and all the characters whom we're introduced to set off on the road. Their mission? To seek out the army of elves, goblins, fairies, and other such races who want to crush them and somehow make peace with them. Perhaps by breaking out a long pipe and tobacco, that would be my guess. But in the way is a great number of deadly giant spiders called Widdershay, which I think is a pretty cool name. Luthiel ends up being the great decision-maker of the group, and her advisor, the sorcerer Mithordan, says there are two ways they can reach the army. Right through the Widdershay, or on the longer path, which could be more or less risky. Luthiel decides to go through the Widdershay, believing her magic sword is all she needs to keep her and her friends safe, since it can cut through the webbing made of shadow that the Widdershay spin. She's soon proven wrong when she observes a bunch of Widdershay kill a number of elves in horrible fashion. I kid you not, this sequence is pretty gruesome, because the spiders don't just wrap up the elven prisoners in webbing, they eviscerate them and make them bleed out. The author tries to make the Widdershay seem like a big deal, and he successfully does it here. After Luthiel and company barely escape, Luthiel decides that maybe the long way around was better after all. And by the way, the Grendelows make their return at this point, which is an original species that I think are too wacky for their own good. A Grendelow, according to the author, appears to be half a man, with only one arm, a six-fingered hand, and a single segmented foot they use to hop around everywhere. While I can't blame the author for trying to be original, his Grendelows just seem to be too weird and cartoony for my taste. Whenever I imagine an army of them hopping around a battlefield, I also imagine a bunch of fleas skittering around a dog's back. And that's enough said about the Grendelows, since I already said my fill in my review of the first installment of Luthiel's Song. Please check it out if you haven't done so already. So the long way to the Phalan army past the Wittershay involves going to another world. No, really. Apparently, there are portals that take you to other planets, including the moons of the main planet, which I assume have breathable atmospheres. Unless there's something I don't know about. Luthiel, the werewolf Othalas, and two others go through a portal to the world of Catharos, which has a day and night cycle that is much longer than Luthiel's homeworld of Osha. What this means is that Catharos' atmosphere is heated to a dangerous degree, and so only trolls can live there for long. Once on Catharos, Luthiel and company race to the nearest exit portal, which will take them back to Osha, to a point that's close to the Phalan army. Time is also not on their side, since they are approaching the end of the day on Catharos, and the strong sunlight causes the land to burn and catch fire. While I think this whole world-jumping concept is interesting, I wish the author had included a few more details. He gives only vague descriptions of the landscape of Catharos, and I was wondering exactly what catches fire once the land starts to burn. Is there any plant life that can fuel the fires? Once they touch back down to Osha, they join the Phalan army, and it's all Luthiel's show as she tries to convince the commanders that it's not the Virile they should fear, but the Wittershay, and whoever the spiders seem to be serving. In short, this high fantasy story is meant to tug at the heartstrings, and fortunately, it's not without teeth. While there are plenty of heartwarming moments, the battle scenes are borderline ruthless and raw. There's the part about the spiders killing elves, of course, and one scene in which Luthiel is being taught how to heal with her magic, and one of her patients is a fairy with a metal spike that's stuck in her head. The author tries to tackle several different themes in this book, such as the politics of war and the meaning of family. One of these themes that's especially fascinating to me concerns religion. There's an ancient belief that two gods, a male and female, had created the world, and that they each deserved equal billing. But there's a wicked ruler named Zelos who, for many years, has been changing the story so that the female god has a reduced role, becoming little more than a servant to her husband. That is to say, Zelos forces his people to believe the retold story, and this has an eventual residual effect on surrounding lands. Zelos' intent is to reduce the role of women in general, making them submissive to men. Apparently, Zelos has a certain prejudice against women, viewing them as the weaker sex and thus unfit for role of any kind, outside of the kitchen. This theme is certainly a reflection of the real world, where there are a number of religions that say that women should be submissive to men because that's what some deity or other wants. I'm not a madman, of course, at least I think I'm not, so I won't go deep into this topic. But what I will say is that I believe there should be a balance in all things. However, such a balance can be reached. The last book I read that dealt with the roles of men and women in religion was called The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, a retelling of the story of King Arthur. And maybe one of these days I'll cover it on this podcast. At any rate, it's a topic that's worth talking about since it plays an important role in our society, and I think it fits well in the story of Luthiel's Song. In my review of the series' first installment, I said the story was riddled with cliches, and although they don't break the story or anything, they can be a little distracting for longtime readers of the fantasy genre. The second installment continues the proud tradition of relying on cliches, and there's one in particular I'd like to bring up. Now, this cliche may be considered a spoiler, and if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know that I don't usually give out spoilers, but I'll make an exception because it's a cliche that happens perhaps far too often in this kind of fantasy story. And that is, the main hero, or in this case heroine, becomes the ruler of all the land. And there's a big coronation ceremony and everything. And while not everyone is happy with this arrangement, there are plenty of people who celebrate anyway. What can I say? Many authors like to have their main characters be placed into a position of power, because there's only so much their heroes can do with a sword and shield. And they like to write about the pomp and circumstance surrounding grand ceremonies where a new king, queen, or emperor, or what have you, is crowned. It's like reliving your high school graduation and feeling big and important all over again. In a story called Luthiel's Song, you might expect, well, some songs. And there are some, particularly when Luthiel is casting a magic spell. Unlike Harry Potter, who can say just one or two words and make amazing shit happen, Luthiel casts spells by singing a song with lyrics that reflect the outcome she wishes to make. She doesn't have to sing, of course, but she finds that singing works best for her. If this sounds unusual and inconvenient to you, it's because it is. You could just chalk it up to romantic sentiment on the author's part. At least it kind of makes sense, since the spells Luthiel casts are meant to be very powerful and specific. There's also another song, sung by Zalas's army, that reveals their prejudice and mindsets. So, unlike the songs in The Lord of the Rings, which are meant to be filler, the songs in this story each have a specific purpose. One last thing about this story, and I suppose it was only inevitable. Once Luthiel comes to power, she receives the special attention of two men. One of them is Galwin, a young man who has always been interested in her back in her home village, and Valros, a skilled swordsman whose life Luthiel had saved in the last installment. The thing is, according to the last book, Luthiel just turned 15 years old. I suppose Galwin is the same age as her, but I imagine Valros is a bit older, perhaps in his mid-20s. Given that Luthiel saved his life, it's understandable why Valros would be attached to her, but romantically? Luthiel is just too young for him. Either I have the wrong idea, or the author didn't consider this awkward circumstance when writing about this. And so that's Luthiel's song, The War of Mists. It's like a Disney movie, but with elves and war and blood and big spiders. The Chronicles of Narnia would be a good comparison, only that story doesn't have a bunch of weirdos, each with one arm and one foot. It's generally well written, and if it sounds good to you, I'd say go for it. And sorry for spoiling it for you. Just remember, I didn't spoil everything. In my next episode, I'll tackle a double review that I've been itching to do for a long time, so please watch out for it. I'm Jason Hubbard. Thanks for listening, and please, keep reading.